Hello to all you Sunderland fans out there, and hello to Phil Smith. Phil, how are you doing, mate?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Starting to come back to normality after the unexpected madness of another playoff campaign. So yeah, all good.
Indeed, we haven't spoken before this podcast, but I was taking a look at the analytics for the show over the past couple of episodes, and nobody cares about our intros anymore. So intros are out, and we're just going to jump straight into it. This is the Raw podcast from the Sunderland Echo. I am James Copley, and this is Phil Smith. Phil, breaking news today: Edouard Michut and his immediate transfer future has become a lot clearer. What's going on, and what do we now know?
Yeah, I don't think it's come as a huge surprise in the end. It's something to confirm today that they they won't be taking up their option to buy clause on Edouard Michut. I suppose the significant thing is we have quotes from Christian Speakman saying it was a mutual decision between the two parties. I think it's probably something that we've come to expect over the last couple of weeks because I think everyone saw Michu's farewell to Sunderland supporters last week on social media, and obviously you can never be clear, but it became pretty obvious from that it was a farewell rather than the sort of see you soon. Obviously aligned with the fact that Joe Bellingham was at the Stadium of Light for the first leg of the Luton game, and the fact that that's a deal that seems to be advancing pretty significantly. I think it put those two things together, put Michu's long-term future in fairly significant doubt. And so what we have today is official confirmation from the club that those talks have taken place and that the mutual decision is that Michu will return to PSG. And I would imagine he'll then sort of assess his options before looking potentially to move elsewhere later in the summer.
It's interesting, isn't it, Phil? Because I remember when news of the Michu transfer story initially broke last summer, I think he was described as Sunderland's dream midfield signing. How true that is or not, I'm not entirely sure. But he came with good pedigree coming from PSG. We all saw him pictured with the likes of Lionel Messi and Mbappe and Ramos. And then it had this clause in the contract, this optional fee that I think everyone, myself included, just sort of assumed that Sunderland would take up at the end of the season. Obviously, that hasn't been the case, as you mentioned, a mutual decision. But how would you assess the journey from him being Sunderland's quote unquote dream midfield signing to that where both parties have decided not to take it up?
Yeah, I have slightly mixed feelings on it. I mean, I think that it's a shame, really, when you've essentially gone through the process of investing in a player and developing him this year because, through that first half of the season, he barely played, really. He was adjusting to the training, he was adjusting to the new league. And it felt like Sunderland almost got through that hard part. And then through the second half of the season, we saw him become much more of a regular in the squad. We started to see what it was all about. And it felt like he was really getting to grips with the championship. If you think of his role, I know he came off the bench, but in Serkin's winner at West Brom, really prominent in that sort of sweeping counter. And so it feels like a bit of a shame that having got through that almost difficult first step, you can't then go on to the next one, which would have been a potentially really exciting moment issue because I think we all see he's an excellent footballer. Having said that, I think the other sort of aspect to it is that Michu hasn't been a regular in the side. He's not Sunderland's player. We've seen Pierre-Emerick come through in recent weeks and he's looked absolutely outstanding. We know Jay Matete is going to be coming back this summer, at least for the pre-season campaign, and he is Sunderland's player and someone they'll want to invest in. And I think if we roll back a little bit to the end of the January transfer window and some of the struggles that Sunderland went through in sort of February around the Stoke game, collectively, I think the assessment was that while Sunderland had a lot of very talented midfielders, the blend wasn't quite right. And it was probably overly on the technical side, and they were probably missing that bit of balance, that bit of physicality. We felt there were too many sort of eights and not enough, not really that cover for Corey Evans. And so in some ways, I'm a bit disappointed. But having said that, I wonder if we're starting to see a little bit of a shift to trying to balance out those midfield options for the Championship next season. And certainly from Michu's perspective, when we're talking about a player coming from PSG, I suspect he would have expected to be a permanent fixture in the side by the end of the year. And that hasn't quite happened. And then obviously the fact that Sunderland haven't won promotion, so it's another year in the Championship, is he kind of prepared to be a squad option, if you like, in the Championship for another year? I suspect that's not the case. So I think in some ways this is a little bit disappointing because you feel like you've gone through the hard phase of the development and not really reaped the rewards. But I do think if you'd said to me one of the key things that Sunderland need to do this summer is to get the balance right in midfield. it's very difficult to judge Joe Bellingham because we haven't seen a huge amount of him. But I wonder if we're starting to see some steps towards that, and that makes it feel a lot more understandable to me.
I do find it a fascinating little transfer story, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. Edouard Michut only made 23 appearances for Sunderland in the Championship, 24 overall, so you're probably right in what you say. He probably wanted to have more of an impact. I find the Fulham thing interesting, Phil, just because thinking of some of the players that maybe can't get into their midfield all of the time. I think probably the best performance I've seen at the stadium like this season, arguably from an opposition player, would probably be Tom Kearney. Slightly different player to Michu, it must be said, with a lot more experience, but he's struggling to get into Fulham's first team, starting Premier League games all of the time. So I just wonder where Michu fits in at Fulham and whether they see him as a development signing, and just your thoughts on that link, really.
Yeah, I think I don't see him. I find it very difficult at this stage to go and see him going straight into a Premier League 11.
Yeah,
I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that we've seen that the potential's there in terms of his technical ability, and I think we did start to see towards the end of the season we started to get into grips with the physicality a little bit. So it will be really interesting to see where he winds up. I don't see him going and being a regular for Fulham, like you say, when you've got players like Kearney who can't get in the side. But having said that, it's kind of what I was going through before. We've seen a lot of Sunderland where players have an up and down first season in senior football, and then they can sort of kick on really quickly. I mean, Dan Neil would be the obvious example, who was brilliant at times last year, ended the season not in a team, and this year his development of his game has been amazing. So it wouldn't be a huge surprise to me to go and see Michu kick on elsewhere. But yeah, for sure, if you'd said to me at any stage really that his next obvious step would be to go to a team, in the top half of the Premier League, I would have probably been quite unsure on that. But I think also the fans will watch his next steps really, really closely, because I think there will be a sense missed opportunities a little bit extreme, but I think everyone understands that this is potentially a guy who in 4 or 5 years' time, everyone could turn around and say, well, why didn't we pay €2.5 million for him? We knew he was good enough to sort of turn a profit on that and to realise that value. But I think you also have to offset that thing, which I think is obviously true, that he could be worth that and a lot more, with what this squad actually needs this summer to replicate and better what they did last year. And I think one of the things we had this discussion a few months ago about Michu on the podcast, and I said then that I don't doubt it's good value, but it's all relative to what your budget for the summer is, because we know that Sunderland need to buy at least one striker this summer. And is the money best spent on another technical number 8, when realistically Sunderland do have a lot of options in those positions in the number 10 role as well. When you think about Embleton coming back as well in pre-season from a broken leg, I do think there was a real need to add a little bit of variety to that midfield in terms of the attributes. Ekwa's sort of rise in the last few weeks is a really encouraging start in that.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, Bellingham could be another piece of that puzzle. As I say, very difficult to objectively compare the two because I haven't seen enough of Bellingham. But, it wouldn't surprise me if in a few years' time we sort of go, how isn't it a bit of a shame that someone didn't buy Michu, but then also recognise that maybe, there were good reasons for it. And that as much applies to the player as much as the club, because, it's not just Sunderland's decision. Even if Sunderland had activated the clause, Michu would have had to agree to it as well. So I think, my overwhelming emotion is it's a little bit of a shame, I think. But I can also understand the reasons for it. And I do definitely think that the balance of the midfield hasn't quite been right over the last few months. And maybe we're starting to see Sunderland address that as well.
Yeah, I can see the reasons why it hasn't been activated, and obviously if the player doesn't want to come, I think that's a important thing. But it will turn into a massive shame if in 3 years he's in the France squad and worth 45 million. You did touch on it slightly earlier, Phil, but in terms of what this means for Sunderland's transfer strategy in the window as a whole, there will be some, rightly or wrongly, that point towards this and say, well, the club weren't prepared to pay this little bit of money towards Edouard Michut, which now is probably being prioritised towards Joe Bellingham. And there may be a few that probably wrongly question expectations. But to me, this does seem like a mutual agreement. It doesn't really seem financial. And I'm not sure it's some sort of massive conspiracy theory that, Sunderland lack ambition.
I don't think so. I mean, it's a gamble in the sense that if Bellingham does arrive, you're essentially, you've opted not to sign a player who's had 10 months in your system and is fairly well integrated. And you've taken a calculated gamble on the risk on another player who hasn't had that time, who you think can potentially exceed what they could have done. So it is a gamble in that sense. I think it's too early to assess the level of ambition that Sunderland have shown this summer. I think if at the end of the day, if Sunderland signed Bellingham, and then they also, for example, were to invest in a couple of young strikers, for example, I think we'd all be pretty enthusiastic about saying, well, look, we understood where the gaps were in the squad off the back of that ultimately quite disappointing January transfer window, and we've seen some steps to try and correct that. So I think it's too early to talk about that. I agree with you. I don't think this is purely a financial decision, although I think that is part of it. I think that there is a budget. Sunderland suddenly their financial state hasn't completely transformed overnight. And so, as I say, I think committing what would be a huge part of the budget to another 2 number 8s, if you like, would have been, in my view, a bit of an error if that detracted from investing in other areas of the squad, which could potentially happen.
Especially in the context of the January and not having that sort of space in the squad and that those funds freed for a striker anyway, which cost Sunderland, you could argue, in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think the striker situation has to be the priority, and certainly the Bellingham move is a strong indicator that there is a willingness to invest in fees this summer. So I don't see this as purely as a financial decision. I think it's a reflection that this would have been a fairly significant investment for the club, and it would have been in a player who neither party was fully sure whether it was the right thing to do. The player not fully sure if this was right at the stage, the right next step in his career, and the club not entirely sure if it was going to represent value for money sort of next season. So I think that while finances will obviously be a part of it, of course they will. I don't think that's the primary driver of this decision. And while I think it's a little bit of a disappointing one in some ways, I can certainly see why it's come to pass.
Indeed. Well, the transfer window isn't even open yet, and we've had some minor drama anyway with the Edouard Michut story. We'll be across all of that, including Sunderland's retain list when it comes out, and any incoming transfer or indeed outgoing transfer deals. We're going to move on to a sort of season review. Me and Phil quite like doing these. Phil, I hope you've got all your notes ready, because I am woefully underprepared for this as usual, but I do have the categories in front of me. We're going to start with your highlight of Sunderland's season. It could be a moment. It could be, well, we have got favourite goals, so probably best not being a goal. But you get the gist.
Yeah, I've gone for maybe a little bit of recency bias here, but I've actually gone for the win away at West Brom. I just thought the cocktail of that day, the fact that it was a win that kept Sunderland's playoff dreams alive pretty much the last day of the season, which just made for this unexpectedly sort of buoyant last couple of weeks and that brilliant day at Preston. The fact that it came right at the absolute apex of Sunderland's injury crisis. The team they put out against a very expensively assembled West Brom side with, one of the division's most highly rated coaches. The fact that they put out a side that kind of really didn't have any right to win. And then the manner as well, coming from behind, having played pretty well in the first half, giving away a fairly soft penalty, and then fought back by scoring 2 brilliant goals, 2 sort of classic Mowbray goals, if you like. And the fact that it was the centre-back, Dennis Erkin, popping up twice in the box. I thought that was my favourite win of the season, because I thought it embodied why the season ended up being way more fun than we had anticipated it would be, because it, as we said, it was a disappointing end to the January window. The injury situation, which just got worse and worse and worse. It felt like it was in the end just going to fizzle out, and we were just going to say, well, there's a lot of positives, a lot to build on. And I thought the West Brom win, so many players out of position, playing in that style against a strong opponent away from home. I feel that kind of summed up why it ended up being such a good season. And that was definitely the biggest sort of buzz I had after a win. I think obviously the Preston one's tempting because it was just such an incredible 10, 15 minutes. And that was right up there. But yeah, there was just something about that win at West Brom. And the Norwich one was similar off the back of it wasn't long after the sort of Stoke defeat, was it? So the Norwich one was similar, but I just thought West Brom, that second goal, the one little 1-2s, the movement, it was just amazing. And yeah, it set up that kind of grandstand finish to the season, which at one stage you'd pretty much given up on.
I've got a couple of little alternative ones for you, none of which are as good as that, but casting my mind back to the win away to Bristol City when Sunderland fans broke that billboard. That was good fun. I thought that was quite funny. I hope everyone was okay from that, because could have been some nasty damaged shins. One a bit more obscure one, but Luke O'Nien on the final home game of the regular season hoisted his baby up to the Roker end, like the Lion King. That was good. What was my other one going to be? I'm trying to think now. It's escaped me. I think Watford away. When Bennett got that equaliser.
Yeah, that was amazing.
That was a good moment.
I think that was a great moment for a couple of reasons. I think off the back of the Rotherham win and the Reading win, it settled the club so much, because obviously in the aftermath of Alex Neil leaving, so much uncertainty, so much concern. And it almost, Mowbray's, the start of his tenure almost built up from that brilliant win against Rotherham to then getting that point at Watford, who we all thought were going to be right up there at that stage. And it was almost just like, oh, you know what, actually we've almost got through this turbulence. It's going to be all right. We knew at that point, I think, that the season wasn't going to unravel. And the manner that they got that point back, Mowbray chucking on Bennett, chucking on Abdullah Bar, who was brilliant. And the other thing, underrated thing about that Bennett goal was that was the first time Ahmad and Roberts played together. Mm-hmm. So that was the first time we saw them, basically Sunderland playing with two right wingers, and Watford just completely collapsed because they were so good. So yeah, that's a great shout. I think that Watford one was a really great moment, because it just sort of, I think it calmed, that little spell calmed everybody and sort of re-underlined that conviction in what Sunderland were doing, which I think was a little bit shaken when Alex Neil left. So that was another real good day. Yeah.
The next category is low light / biggest frustration. I'll start on this, actually. Obviously, I think the biggest frustration has to be the 2 injuries to Ross Stewart, and then Ellis Sims being recalled. The whole striker situation has been a massive frustration for Sunderland fans, and I think that culminated for me. When you look back at this season, there was a week in October. Sunderland had back-to-back games at the stadium, like Sunderland, Preston, Sunderland, Blackpool, both ended goalless. If we'd have had a striker for them, you know, do you? And it's all hearsay for the rest of the season. But who knows where Sunderland could have finished, because we ended up doing pretty well without one.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, ultimately what we saw in the aftermath of the Stewart, the second Stewart injury at Fulham, I think Sunderland coped a hell of a lot better without having that kind of natural striker, for a couple of reasons. I think one, ultimately, although he had a tough start, I thought Geldhart got to grips with the role, not being the orthodox number 9, but just his sheer work rate and his first touch meant he was meant to make a real fist of it. And also by that point, Ahmad was playing so well, so regularly, that he was able to, I think, almost something got to grips with, okay. And it did cost them at home. I'm not sort of rewriting history. It massively cost them points at home. But I thought in the second phase of that, they kind of got to grips with how they could win a game, even despite all these issues. Whereas I think you're right, those two home games underlined them struggling, I think, in that first phase without Stewart.
And we'll talk about strikers, but Sunderland was still amongst the highest scorers in the league this season.
They were. And I think that reflects the fact that they generally, certainly the second time round, they sort of got to grips with it. But I think that it did still cost them at home right until the very end of the season. And even though they beat Luton in the first leg of the playoff, that was a game that they won 2-1. But you did kind of think, if there'd just been that option up front, whether to bring off the bench or whatever, you never know. So I think that has to be one of the biggest frustration: the injuries / not getting the deals over the line. And I don't think it necessarily was, a question of ambition or whatever. I know that Sunderland were looking, for example, at young strikers from Brighton on deadline day who decided they didn't want to drop into the Championship. And they've ultimately gone on to play a lot of football under Roberto De Zerbi and might be in the Europa League next year. Those are the Andras Nemeth, who we thought was going to sign, and in the end decided to go to Hamburg. So that's not saying errors weren't made. There were. I'm just saying I don't think it was an ambition thing. I just think it was almost something, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And I think that probably led to the other low light, which was the Stoke game, wasn't it? Which was you just had a team that was you just had a team that was ill-equipped and to deal with, for obvious reasons, a very, very fired up Alex Neil's Stoke City.
Shame that drubbing came against them, to be honest.
Yeah, but I think it was part of it. I think there was a tension in the team. I think there was a tension around the ground, that fed into that performance. And it was probably a day that I think Mowbray admitted he didn't get quite right. He tried to sort of double down on that sort of really technical style. And that was a real low moment. But on the flip side, you have to then credit the team for the way they fought back from that, because that could easily have been the point at which we sat here looking back now and going, well, they just never really recovered from that Stoke game, and the injuries got worse and the confidence ebbed away, and that was the turning point. In the end, we're talking about it as a one-off. It's really, obviously, some of the issues from that game meant, they stayed, because obviously Sunderland still struggled at home. The draw with Huddersfield being a classic example. So some of the issues still remained, but the fact that Sunderland managed to battle back and not let that come to define the second half of the season, I think was a really impressive feat in its own right.
No, I agree. Right, we'll whiz through these quite quickly. Favourite goal? Phil, are you going with the obvious?
No, I'm not actually, because I didn't really see that goal.
Right, okay. Did you have your head in the laptop, did you?
Well, I didn't have a great view from the press box at Reading, so I sort of only saw the second half of the goal. It wasn't until I saw the replay later that I realised why everyone was buzzing. I've actually gone for Ahmad at Wigan.
Nice.
Because I think off the back of obviously Sunderland won the last minute against Blackburn at home on Boxing Day, Ella Sims winner. And that was a real high point in the season for me. Then a couple of days later to go to a Wigan side. I know it's easy in retrospect to say what a disastrous season Wigan had, but at that point they were still very much fighting. A lot of their major issues hadn't really started.
They were still being paid at that point.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure they were actually, but it was certainly less severe than it is now. But I think the manner
should mention that Wigan players have now been paid. So
I was going to say careful. But the manner of Sunderland's performance, the manner of Ahmad's performance, and then that final goal, the little 1-2 with Roberts, and then he just smashes it in from out. It was just in the away end, which was full, because you always get a huge allocation at Wigan. That was just such an amazing goal. And at that point, really, pretty much anything felt possible. Obviously, that began to change when Stewart gets injured the next month, Sims gets recalled, etc., etc. And then we went through another fairly tricky period. But yeah, that was the goal that most just sort of my jaw just dropped and just thought, where on earth has this team come from? I thought they would be competitive this year, but I saw it in a very different way. I saw it in a, two up front, Alex Neil, quite direct, I think, really aggressive. And then all of a sudden, this brilliant passing team with Ahmad and Roberts, and it just absolutely blossomed. And that for me was just that moment of something's happening here. This isn't a battling against relegation. Something is really starting to emerge.
Not a normal Sunderland team, really. Not something we've ever seen before. Like that, this brand of football is something I'm very unfamiliar with. And if you remember, there were questions when Mowbray started playing Roberts and Ahmad sort of side by side. It was like, oh, hang on a minute, what's he doing here? Like,
and I think Ahmad embodied that, didn't he? Because he signs in Man United, and you start going, okay, well that's great. He's obviously come for a lot of money, but he's not played a lot of football. Didn't work at Rangers. What's his position? Is that really what Sunderland needed? And then it was, it doesn't matter, just play him anyway.
Just get him on the pitch.
Stick him on the pitch. And I think so that was a night that I absolutely loved, and that goal. And there was that brilliant still, wasn't there, of Bailey Wright and Dan Neil just stood behind it with their hands on their heads. Like what has he just done? And that was such a fun little spell. Would have been Christmas and stuff as well. It was just a great time. Really great. That was probably my favourite little spell of the season. I think coming back off the World Cup break, Stewart being fit again, which obviously sadly didn't last, and he was banging in the goals. That was a great little phase, and hopefully something that someone can get back. They can have that power of having those defenders and that big centre forward up front, but they can keep a little bit of that magic as well. That was sort of it might not have been the best football they played in that spell, but it was the best they were all round as a team, without a shadow of a doubt. And hopefully that's something we can recapture next year.
I want to give a shout out to Roberts' goal against Watford, because that was obviously crucial. Quality, dire embers of the game, under massive pressure at home in front of a sellout crowd. And it's just brilliant strike.
Brilliant strike, and underappreciated at the time, because we all felt it was a game Sunderland had to win. And obviously circumstances came to define that it wasn't a game Sunderland had to win. And actually that point made all the difference. So it probably didn't get quite the level of love it deserved, but that was a stunning finish, yeah.
Player of the season, Phil. For me, there are a number of candidates. Who are you going for?
I've actually gone with Jack Clarke. I think that
Good
Danny
shout.
Bart was a very, very strong choice. I know he won the sort of fans player of the season, didn't he? I think that was deserved. Tempting to go with Ahmad, incredibly tempting, because I think his individual quality was probably the difference in so many games. I just think for Clarke to play almost every single championship game, to end up across all competitions with plus 10 goals, plus 10 assists, I think it was an amazing level of consistency from a player where consistency would have been the big question mark going into the season. He was fit. He sometimes played wing back and did so pretty well. He tracked back and got stuck in. I think the level of consistency he produced over the course of the season for a player in a position that you would normally say, oh, well, they'll go through little spells and they'll sort of go through little spells where they burn out a little bit. And for him to just relentlessly do it 3 times a week over the full course of the season, I thought it was amazing, really. And I think he's the one player who's taped for me. I think you could put Dan Neil in this category because of the way he's adjusted his role. But for me, he's the player I think has taken the biggest step forward this season. He's gone from a potentially talented winger who can do something special to someone who's effective and productive every single game. I think that's a hell of a feat. And so I think it's that consistency and that durability is why I think he probably deserves it. For me, anyway.
It's interesting, the Clarke thing as well, just very, very quickly, because we've talked about them there, but Robertson and Ahmad, it's all been about Robertson and Ahmad. Clarke's had his praise, and rightly so, but a lot of the talk, a lot of the discussion in tactical analysis has been Roberts and Ahmad playing together, and does that hinder Gelhardt and Clarke? Well, it can't have hindered Clarke that much because he's got 23 goal contributions.
Yeah, he's maybe benefited from it at times. Maybe he's benefited from the fact that teams have been so worried about doubling up on Ahmad and Roberts. But you're right, he doesn't get the level of Sunderland, he doesn't get a huge amount of support from his fullback on that other side, because naturally they have to be quite defensively minded to compensate for the fact that you're playing with 2 right wingers. But yeah, I think his ball carrying ability, his end product, which is still a work in progress, but has improved immensely. Fantastic season, and absolutely no surprise that Premier League teams are sort of looking at him, because I've not seen any left wingers in this division who've performed with his consistency this season. It's immense credit to him, and a brilliant bit of business, because they didn't spend 10 million on him. Let me tell you that. I'm not even sure they spent 1 million on him up front. And sure, it'll be sell-ons and bonus clauses and stuff. But let me tell you, that is one of the bargains of the season. Even if the Sky Sports ticker thing said it was 10 million, trust me, it wasn't. That was one of the bargains of the season. That.
No, absolutely. So Jack Clarke for your player of the season. I agree, but could have easily gone with Danny Batth or Amad Diallo. We'll move on to young player of the season next, Phil.
Really hard to do this, because really they could all be player of the season or young player of the season. Such is the way Sunderland's squad goes. I went with Trey Hume in the end, though.
Good
because
shout,
I think if you track his development from not really getting in the team at the start of the season to becoming this cult hero, for being this throwback right back who crunched into challenges, wins loads of headers even though he's not that tall.
That tackle against McLean, I forgot about that tackle against McLean at Wigan. That was just such quality, to be honest. Such a quality tackle.
But then from that platform to build in these little bits of his game where Mowbray is asking him to pop up in midfield, and he's sort of playing as the Philip Lahm role. I think he's had an amazing season. And it's got to the point now where if the first game of the season next year, Trey Hume's not in the team, we're all going to be going, what's happened there? It would be a massive shock. That's an incredible pace of development in a short space of time. And I think his level of consistency is similar to the Clarke thing, really. I can't tell you when he's had a bad game, really, over the last 6 months. Another unbelievable find, really. And I think he's been fantastic.
Linfield for a couple of £100,000. It's amazing, really. And then moving into centre back, as you mentioned as well, very impressive. I think because I would have gone with Bath for the player of the season, I'd probably go with Ahmad for the young player of the season. But we've been through that. So let me have a look. What is next on our little list? Give me a second. Right. So, player you want to see more of next season. I'll start on this. I think there's actually three. Bennett, I would like to see more of next season. Obviously, Lahaji and Shealy, because he's really turned on the quality. I'm really, really, really looking forward to seeing more of Pierre Ekwa.
Yeah, I think Echo is the one who springs to mind in terms of if he can build on what he started to show in the last few weeks of the season, then we've potentially got a really exciting prospect on our hands. One of the nicest footballers I've ever interviewed as well. So really hoping he can kick on from that. I think for me, Lahaji was the obvious one in terms of if we look at what Sunderland have done so well in the last sort of 18 months, it's been almost finding those players who, for whatever reason, their career has gone off track a little bit, and they come in, they put them on that program, they put a lot of trust in them, and they really kick on again. We've seen it with Clark and Roberts, and I can totally understand why it hasn't happened with Lahaji just yet, because the idea was Sunderland probably wouldn't be in the playoff positions towards the end of the season, and then we could rotate and we could have a look at these young players. But when you genuinely going for the playoffs, how on earth do you leave Ahmad out of the team?
Well, exactly. And
How
he
on
has
earth
just
do you
moved
drop
from
Roberts?
France as well. He has just moved from France,
Yeah,
so
so
it's a big move.
he was probably the one player who sort of missed out really because of the fact that Sunderland's season went better than anyone could have anticipated. And so he's someone that I'm really keen to see more of through pre-season. There is going to be a major gap in this squad with no Ahmad next year. The one positive that I think you can take forward is that Sunderland now are going to be a seriously attractive destination for young loan players. Because I think Ahmad perfectly showed to those big Premier League clubs, we'll trust your young players and we'll play them, but they'll also get a real Premier League environment, 40,000. They'll get all the pressures that you want to know if they can handle when they come back to your club, and they'll also get the exposure. So I don't want to be too pessimistic about it, because I think there's a chance someone could find another gem. But I do think the Haji's going to have to play a part next year, and it's going to be really exciting and interesting to see how he goes, because his pedigree is huge. He's not somebody who hasn't played at a particularly high level. He has got, albeit he hasn't done it
He's got
regularly.
a league title under his belt, actually.
Yeah, so he's someone that I think I'm hoping will be the one who breaks through next year, who can come back in pre-season, feel a little bit more settled in the environment, and we'll really start to see the best of him. But I think Ekwa's the obvious one. I think everyone would say Ekwa, just because we all, after that Preston game in the first leg against Luton particularly, we all just went, wow, yeah, this could be something. So I think he is the other one who jumps out for sure.
Indeed. So last one is overall mark out of 10 for the season. I'll start with a very brief description. I'll probably go for a solid 9. One of the most enjoyable seasons I can remember as a Sunderland fan. Some of the best football. Didn't really have too many expectations coming into it, but to still be involved in the playoff hunt on the last day, but then to get in and then to think that we might sneak a Wembley place being 2-1 up from the first leg. I think the only thing that lets the season down is the disappointment of the second leg, but that shouldn't cloud our judgment of what has been a really, really memorable, fun, exciting season. I mean, how many seasons have we had that have not been fun, memorable, or exciting in League One, the Championship, and the Premier League, where it's just been a complete slog, getting turned over, playing rubbish football with players that don't really care, with a manager that you know isn't going to be there longer than 6 months. But now things are on the up, it feels.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, listen, I don't remember a Sunderland side playing this style of football to such a degree in my lifetime. It's been incredible to watch. I gave it an 8 out of 10 just because there were some obvious sort of disappointing moments through the season when you think of the departure of Alex Neil. Like you said, that real first spell without Stewart and Sims was a slog. I don't think that's been sort of negative or unfair. It was a slog. And we have had some spells like that in the second half of the season. But of course, all season has its ups and downs. I think for me, it's been the building of this fantastic platform with a core of an exciting young squad that can potentially go on and do something pretty special, I think, in the next 2 to 3 years. It's been one of my favourite seasons. It's been my favourite season in the job by a huge distance, although that isn't saying a huge amount, to be
I was going to
fair.
say, your first season was the Championship relegation season, wasn't it? So
No, my first season was the Premier League relegation.
right,
so,
okay, and then
yeah,
the Championship.
yeah.
Baptism of fire for poor Phil.
Yeah. So it's been an amazing season, but the important thing is to build on it now. It is only a platform. So yeah, fingers crossed. It's going to be a fascinating summer, isn't it? It's going to be so interesting. Come the first week of the season when we do our preview podcast, how do we assess someone's business? How are the other teams who came down from the Premier League looking? Because they could potentially be fearsome if they get it right.
Southampton for one.
Yeah, so it's going to be really interesting to see where our heads are at when we check in at the start of the season.
No, absolutely. And for all of that sort of analysis, head over to the Sunderland Echo website. Shameless plug in there. That probably brings an end to the podcast, Phil. Thank you very much for joining me once again. Thank you for listening to The Raw.